A very warm welcome to all the panelists present here today with us. The panel is slightly delayed because of the connectivity issues. I welcome all the speakers here with us today on the topic national business is shaping with us during the pandemics. I heartily welcome Dr. James, who is the professor and head CTIL, Dr. Abhijit Das, Head and Professor, Center for WTO Studies, IIFT. A very, very warm welcome to Dr. Suresh Nanwani, Professor in Practice, Durham University, UK. And a very warm welcome to Dr. Appleton, founding partner, Appleton Luff International, Geneva. Over to you, Dr. James. Please give an introduction, and as a moderator of the session, I hand over the stage to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vinakshi. I think it is a great pleasure to join this esteemed panel. And we are going through a crisis, a major crisis which is still not over. So we have got an amazing list of people who work in different areas of international trade, on development assistance. And during this 1 hour, we are going to examine how the international business is actually being shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of my questions will be related to international trade, intellectual property rights, and also with respect to the development dimensions. So now let me just give some opening remarks. My own feeling is that this pandemic is actually happening almost after a century. The last one was in 1919. And when we framed the rules of international trade, we did not actually think about a pandemic or a global health crisis of this particular order. And some of the rules of the international trade regime are not in a position to respond to the pandemic in an appropriate manner. We know that most of the governments all across the world is actually going through a recession or in a recession phase. And the government kitty is actually short of cash. At this moment, what can be done by most of the sovereign governments in order to help the economy, to make sure that the business is actually back on track? What can be done? What is actually the permissible level of intervention? And we have got some interesting issues, especially with respect to the disciplines under the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement. When a government is actually giving certain kind of a bounty or even a certain kind of a stimulus to help the economy bounce back, it can potentially violate the rules of international trade. Again, there are potential issues with respect to health. The major issue is that, as the WHO pointed out, there is some kind of a vaccine nationalism. Every country is trying to come out with a vaccine, and that too by early 2021. When the vaccine is out, will there be patent rights, intellectual property rights on the vaccine? And will it actually impede the ability of developing countries, small economies in timely respond to this health emergency? That is going to be a major concern. So in the latter part is actually with respect to the development aid. We know that most of the economies are going through a hard phase. At this moment, what can the international or multilateral aid agencies like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or the Asian Development Bank, or the Islamic Development Bank can do? So these are some of the important issues. So we have got some kind of a focus on the international economic law aspects during this particular discussion. So without further ado, let me invite the first speaker, who is Professor Abhijit Das. Professor Das doesn't need any introduction in the context of India and international trade policy. He has worked for years and years in the Indian trade policy making, first as a career bureaucrat in the Department of Commerce, and later in the UNCTAD project of India, and joined the Center for WTO Studies as its head in 2011. So almost completed 10 years. So Professor Das, you had championed the cause of developing countries. You also were instrumental in making a proposal to the World Trade Organization to seek certain kind of a waiver from the TRIPS provision. Can you explain to the benefit of the audience how or what kind of changes are actually required in the international trading system in order to meet the challenges of the pandemic? You will have roughly 5 minutes. So once you complete it, I think I will go to all the speakers and then again come back to you if you have the time. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, James, and thanks to INBA for inviting me. It's a privilege to be in this very august audience. I'm going to make three very quick points. The first point relates to the waiver from the TRIPS obligations. It is a given that even if we have, let's say, half a dozen vaccines in the market, by end of next year, if the COVAX mechanism or voluntary licensing mechanism works at full throttle, not more than 25 to 30% of the world population will be able to receive the vaccine. That will leave a very, very large proportion of the population absolutely vulnerable to COVID-19 pandemic. Bear in mind that even if just a handful of people carry the infection, they still have the potential to infect a very large segment of the population, herd immunity notwithstanding. So it's absolutely essential that as large a fraction of the world population has access to the medicine sooner rather than later. With that broad objective in mind, India and South Africa have at the WTO made a proposal, and this proposal is now being co-sponsored by many other developing countries as well, and it has received overwhelming support from a large number of developing countries. What this proposal seeks to achieve is that for the duration of the pandemic and for combating the pandemic, certain very specific obligations under the TRIPS agreement should be kept in abeyance. And how will this help? The first route through which this will help is countries will have greater flexibility to issue compulsory licensing. They can issue compulsory licensing even now without the TRIPS waiver for domestic production. But for export purposes, particularly to countries which lack the manufacturing capacity, there is a provision in the TRIPS agreement, rather the amended provision in the TRIPS agreement, which allows countries to issue compulsory licensing for export purposes. But this provision is very complex, and over the past decade or so, it has been used just once. And the firm which used this provision said never again. I'm not going to invoke this provision. It is so hopelessly complex and so time consuming. And if time is of essence, then earlier we ratchet up the vaccine production in all the facilities where potential exists for manufacturing the vaccine, much better for humanity. And one way of doing that would be to, at least on a temporary basis, for combating COVID, let's use to the extent possible all the vaccine manufacturing facilities for producing the vaccines whose efficacy gets proven and which get marketing approvals. Linked with that is not just the patents issue, but also certain issues around trade secrets. Again, if we are able to keep some trade secrets in abeyance, that is likely to lead to a enhancement in capacity for producing vaccine. So that that is the crux of what India and South Africa are proposing to do. I would also like to very quickly touch upon two small issues. We've seen policy articulations in many countries, both developed and developing, in the wake of the pandemic, recognizing the importance of local production and self-sufficiency. This is both in the arena of food as well as medical products, pharmaceuticals, reagents, medical devices. We are likely to see an increasing trend towards self-sufficiency. So all the homilies that we may hear at the WTO about need for enhancing cross-border trade, Some of it we need to take with a pinch of salt. We will gradually see much of business or some part of the business being cornered by local production. The third point which I wanted to make is to address the question posed by James. What can countries do? What can economies do for raising revenue, for raising resources? There is one area of international business which has really thrived in this arena of pandemic. That is the digital economy. Now, very few countries have thought of imposing taxes on some of these digital products, subject to countries having the flexibility
Yes, sir.
services commitments. Some
What,
of
sir?
them could actually think in terms of putting some taxes on imported digital products. It will
Yes,
not
sir.
be a very popular thing to do, no doubt. Big tech will be up in arms. But if a country is constrained for resources, maybe this could be one way forward. I'm going to stop at that, James, and happy to interact later. James, I'm done.
James, you.
James, we don't hear you.
James, Dr. Suresh, can you hear me? Mr. Suresh, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear
Dr.
you.
Arthur?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, so it's the only issue with the James now that we are not able to hear. Now, yeah, he's using a now headphone. So please go ahead, James.
James, are you muted?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
It's
not.
sometime he's supposed to know. He's lost a connection. He's has a problem with
Can you send me the link
internet
again?
No. Yeah, I can hear you right now. James. Yeah.
Hello.
You
Yes,
use
we
a
can hear you
headphone.
now.
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. I'm sorry.
Yes.
This is actually the challenge in using the technology, right? Okay. So I think I think we have recovered. So thank you, Professor Abhijit Das. So now let me turn to Dr. Aadhaar Appleton. He again doesn't need much of an introduction. He has been working in the field of international trade for a long time. He has been teaching also in some of the leading institutions, including the World Trade Institute in Bern, and also the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. So the one major complaint about the international trade system is that the rules of the system at the moment is not actually fit for purpose. And I have outlined some of the issues, including the stimulus given by the government, the various categories of economic bounties given by various governments to help the business to tackle this particular epidemic. So what kind of changes, in your opinion, are required to the system, to the trading system, so that we can tide over this crisis?
That is a very good and a very important question. But before I begin, let me thank the Bar Association, INBA, for inviting me, and Vinakshi for doing the technical work, and to say it is a pleasure to be virtually in New Delhi among friends. There are many shortcomings with the trading system, but we need to realize that we can't pin all of the blame on the intellectual property regime. As Professor Das knows, the proposal from South Africa and India did not receive a positive response last Friday at the WTO. The United States and the EU were quite negative. I think it's going to be very difficult to make major changes to the intellectual property regime. I prefer, James, where you started, which would be changes to the subsidies regime.
Yeah.
I think that there are many subsidies that would be very, very useful to have in times of pandemic. And in fact, we see that the United States moved in that direction by subsidizing the research and development and the vaccine manufacture. These same subsidies that would help deal with the pandemic would also be very, very useful to deal with environmental problems and environmental technology as well. The problem with the intellectual property approach is that when we look at India, for instance, India already makes 60% of the world's vaccines. You're a major manufacturer of vaccines. South Africa also has vaccine capacity through its government, a company called BioVac. So I think people will be skeptical with the proposal coming from India because of your prowess in the vaccine field. You have 10 of the largest generic companies in the world as well, and you're working closely, of course, with AstraZeneca for distribution of the vaccine. I would say instead that what your proposal does do positively is put pressure where it is needed on the pharmaceutical companies, which is in effect, I think we can all agree that's part of the strategy, which is in effect what led to the compulsory licensing breakthroughs that we saw, though Professor Das is right, they have not been as successful as we would have expected. Now, this kind of pressure, I think, is very important because there's a pricing issue here. And that is that the vaccine costs for even India probably need to be reduced to around 50 cents a dose to make it accessible to everyone. And there is no reason, if the pharmaceutical companies can recoup their costs in the research and development and have a reasonable profit, that they should not be able to develop pricing arrangements that are suitable for developing countries around the world. And I think that your proposal, Professor Das, moves in that direction, and that would be very important. Now, there are other shortcomings, of course, with the system as well, and that is the monopoly approach that we see companies taking, or the United States taking. The United States basically took a lot of the production of remdesivir, which is being used to treat patients. And that means because of manufacturing shortcomings, it's not going to be available widely around the world. So I would say probably the two areas where we could focus on would be subsidies, improving the subsidy regime where we can target pandemics, other diseases, because it's not just COVID, it's also pneumonia, influenza, AIDS, TB, malaria that are running rampant in the world. And the second area I would say where we could make progress would be in the monopoly approach, antitrust laws, competition laws, so that licensing limitations are overcome, allow for a reasonable profit for pharmaceutical companies so they have an incentive to invest in research and development, but make sure that the necessary vaccines are widely available around the world, particularly in developing countries. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Appleton. Very valid points. So I would like to now to move on to Dr. Suresh Nanwani. In fact, one of the larger questions, I think, which is actually asked in the context of the pandemic, is the meaning of the term development, and that is particularly important to a discussion which is actually taking place at the time of the commemoration of the Constitution. So when we think about development, we know that development itself is actually a kind of a freedom, the right to development. In a country like India, we have got different states and different layers of development. The situation in Kerala may be very different from the situation maybe in some other parts of India. So the one challenge is that this particular pandemic has exposed so many wounds within our social system, and to an extent it has actually exposed, and to an extent it has weakened the ability of the government to respond to it. And one particular challenge which I have seen is the digital divide challenge, because nowadays everything has actually gone online. Sometimes the education has become completely online. Most of the businesses have become completely online. Even with respect to lawyers, the courtroom hearings have gone completely online. So there is a digital divide in the world. So my question to Dr. Nanwani is, do you think that the meaning and contours of the term development has undergone a major change in the backdrop of the pandemic? And secondly, how multilateral lending institutions can actually step in order to alleviate the pains?
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. I also, like Arthur, would like to give my thanks to you for inviting me to speak, and also Meenakshi, Kaviraj, and Babita, and also I thank my illustrious colleagues in the panel. I take the point in terms of development, having worked in development for 30 years at World Bank, working experience at World Bank, ADB, and EBRD. These banks, starting of course with the World Bank, came up with development, and that's how we got the World Bank, IBRD development. And then you see a string and a plethora of development institutions thereafter. And at this point, it is very telling, because development itself is a word that, as you rightly mentioned, you have a UN convention and treaties on that. What does development really mean? We have really panned out from that. Of course, at the beginning, it was what I would consider the hard part, the hard infrastructure, building a road, recovery from World War II, that France was the first borrower. But we're past 1945. We're now in 2020. And as you rightly mentioned, I think everything has to be seen in context. The pandemic is, the first of its kind that we are witnessing since 1919. World Bank has got a very telling report in June, on a report that says this is the worst ever recession, deepest global recession. Coming from the World Bank, that's really telling. Deepest global recession since World War II. At that time, many countries that we know now didn't exist. I really like to take the opportunity to see things from where things were in 1945 to now. So we've got development, as I said, economic development that's typically seen through that lens, and then social development, soft sectors, social sectors, health, education, and then you have new areas, law and policy reform, that would never have struck multilateral development banks in 1945 because the focus was different. But of course, in the 90s, you see that. Sri Lanka, for example, and I'm just throwing that as an example, had a justice sector act. Same too for Pakistan, access to justice programs, Mongolia as well. But all that was in 2000, late 1990s onwards. And then we have IT, trade facilitation with WTO. So we see different types. And of course, now with the pandemic, the kind of assistance takes on a different level. It is, of course, seen in a wider sense. It is health. My colleagues have talked about vaccines. I'm sure I would include PPEs inside. Those are what we call support. But I want to underscore, it is not just that. It has been a huge setback for countries, and I'm talking now with partiality, I'm talking of developing countries, yeah. Although I know it's universal, because that's what development is for. It's for the developing countries, the borrowing countries. It's not for those advanced countries, although everyone and every country is affected in that sense. We have institutions that have guiding principles, fighting poverty, promoting shared prosperity. That's the World Bank. Other institutions send the same message. EBRD, similar message with a slight difference. It is focused more on private sector development as we know it, but it's still the same message of transition. And now we have issues coming from what's happening. So I'm just going to take World Bank, for example. It has said it is repositioning itself from regular operations to mount an exceptional crisis response. I repeat, from regular operations to mount an exceptional crisis response. So what does that mean? You've got MDBs coming up to say, we've got something now, a COVID response package, extra funds to plow in on that, in addition to what is called the typical lending. So we have that distinct factor. In ADB, for example, a 20 billion COVID-19 response package was announced in April 2020. Then there's a new modality introduced in ADB called the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Option, CPRO. So you have different institutions coming up with modalities, operations, but they are still doing their normal lending, but you can see there's a change in focus now because let's help these countries. So you have, for example, interesting connects because you have ordinary business plus new business operations. You have collaboration with development partners and other stakeholders to ensure complementarity. And you have resilience. If there's one thing I want to underscore, it is resilience. That is so much needed. So you see that as a mantra from these development institutions. We need resilience. EBRD in its annual meeting said, we set sights on resilience. I think you mentioned digital divide. Let me go into that. I think that's a perfect example. This might not have been on the issue before, but it is more so now. And why more so now? Because at these times you realize there is a problem. Take education, for example, India, many countries, even in Indonesia, where how do you educate the people? It's really a telling story. And, I take the example of India, for example. India has got an emergency response and health systems preparedness project from AIIB and ADB. India has also got, I'm just flicking it through, a COVID-19 active response and expenditure support called CARES from AIB and ADB as lead co-financier. And then India has got an emergency assistance program in combating COVID-19, a program loan from NDB, that's the New Development Bank, $1 billion. And then you have also from the World Bank as well. So you can see the kind of assistance and I'm bringing up India because we are at this event in India virtually. So I like to just bring that up. So digital divide is something very important. Having said that, I can see that from what I've been reading, digital divide, in fact, quite recently, in this year, in June, in education, India got a huge loan from World Bank in June thereabouts for education, $500 million, and it was for education. But again, it's for the Ministry of human resources and human resources. And it talks of digital divide again for education, implementation guidelines from the national authority down to the states. So, it's really important, digital divide. And new areas are coming up, new areas. And I want to just even step out of digital divide, because if this pandemic has caused any other problem, it is inclusion. It is women who are suffering, the informal sector. That's so important. It's the vulnerable children. These sectors need to be factored. I think if you look at BBC, they would say, I read it the other day, it's going to set back women equality 20 years, 25 years back. It's amazing. If we realize all that, what's happening, something needs to be done. Countries need to support, to have systems in place. And I'm talking now of projects that can be financed by these institutions, or private sector. And you need to have interaction, you need to have collaboration to make things work. Quite apart from going back, and I loved it, Arthur and what Abhijit mentioned, vaccines and all that. You need collaboration with Gavi, you need collaboration with WHO, you need collaboration with as many partners as you can. And the reason is simple. It is unity that works.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Nanwani. In fact, you actually made a very valid point. This is actually the time of survival. And when we have to survive, we have to collaborate and cooperate with people. So let me actually now go back to Professor Abhijit. You rightly mentioned that the efforts actually made during the early 2000 in having the TRIPS waiver and then carrying out the amendment later actually yielded a very poor outcome. In terms of the agreement, of course, there is a change in the provision, but it cannot be used by anyone. But I'm just looking at the opportunity of a crisis. I mean, a crisis is a great opportunity which we shouldn't waste at all. So do you think that in terms of systemic reform or modification or amendment to the WTO provision, this pandemic has actually created some kind of an opportunity, or at least a moment where countries can sit back and then critically reflect on the areas where there should be some structural changes? Because we have now really understood the deficiencies within the system, and now the WTO system requires a change. So what are the areas which, in your opinion, are critical and which will be hastened by this particular pandemic?
Thank you, James. Let me respond to your questions and also to some of the excellent points raised by Dr. Appleton. If there is one lesson which this crisis has driven home, then that lesson is
Sir, Dr. Abhijit, Mr. Abhijit Das has lost a connection.
No, we can hear. We can hear.
Yeah,
Okay.
we hear Anthony.
I can hear.
We can hear. Yeah, all of us can hear.
If there is one
it's me.
that has emerged very clearly from the COVID crisis,
Right.
that lesson is the following. Countries have sought to leverage this crisis to enhance market access. And if you look at some of the proposals that are on the table, you'll be pleasantly surprised. What are the products for which countries want market access to combat COVID? Ice creams.
Right.
Various forms of alcoholic beverages, cut flowers. So I'm very clear in my mind that instead of making systemic changes, countries are salivating at the prospect of using the COVID crisis as an opportunity of extracting market access concessions. So I really do not see any genuine attempt at systemic reforms. It is more an opportunism which is being displayed by countries. A very quick response to some of the very valid concerns and points mentioned by Dr. Appleton. I, for one, do not see how the subsidies agreement prevents the United States from giving billions of dollars of subsidies to the pharmaceutical companies for enhancing vaccine production. If it's a production subsidies agreement would just not come in the way. Dr. Appleton, I have known you over the years. You're a very fine gentleman, a very kind and a generous-hearted person. So perhaps you view the global pharmaceutical giants through the similar lens. Unfortunately, the reality is that the generosity which permeates your thinking certainly is far from the thinking of the pharmaceutical companies. You've talked of trying to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies. I'm afraid it works the other way around. The US pharmaceutical companies, the European pharmaceutical companies, or the Japanese pharmaceutical companies, they attempt to bring to bear enormous pressure, enormous political pressure on countries, developing countries that try to invoke the TRIPS flexibilities. We can't forget what happened in South Africa in 2000 and 2001, when South Africa sought to import cheaper medicines for combating AIDS. And given that reality, I, for one, would be extremely skeptical, and I'll be really delighted if pharmaceutical companies which are in the race for producing the vaccine agree to limit their profits to a reasonable level. I do not think that's going to happen in my lifetime. And that is not going to happen voluntarily. That's not going to happen through any goodwill. That just is not on the cards. And I wouldn't be too dismayed by what has happened in the TRIPS Council recent informal meeting. The TRIPS proposal has got support from a very large number of developing countries. US has opposed it, which is absolutely on expected lines. When the Doha decision on TRIPS and access to affordable medicine was agreed in 2001, till 2 months before that, the US was very, very firmly objecting to that decision. So it's really a question of, if we really want to enhance production of the vaccines, we have to move resolutely forward, address to the extent possible the concerns of US, European Union, and few others who have raised some concerns. I'm sure there are enough valid reasons for justifying the waiver. I'll just stop at that. James, are you there?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Abhijit. I actually lost you for a few minutes, in between. But actually, I heard about your pessimistic note about the pharmaceutical companies never actually coming down and voluntarily doing on their.
I think James has lost connection. So
But
I will may request
James
you
is
one of you.
no, I can hear you.
James is
Yeah,
back.
coming. Yeah, James is back.
Yeah, I think they could hear me. So great. So I think we have got time for maybe 2 more questions. So I will ask one question to Dr. Aadhaar Appleton. So the point
It
here is
has
that
advantage and disadvantage. So
Kaviraj Singh ji, we are speaking. Okay,
happens.
right. Okay, my question is actually on the financial
And
paydown packages.
what you can do is somebody from among
Kaviraj Singh
you
ji,
can
Kaviraj Singh ji,
continue
can you?
with the talk so that until James is here, so
No, I'm here.
audience keeps engaged.
Kaviraj Singh ji, I'm very much actually on the line. People can hear me. So can you mute yourself? Okay, I think now I can freely speak. So one comment which I wanted to ask, or maybe a question which I want to put to Dr. Appleton is, during this time, a number of governments are providing financial packages and financial bailouts to industry, and the industry who is receiving the benefit may not be in the pharmaceutical sector. So Professor Abhijit Das again mentioned about the market access issues, where instead of the PPs getting the market access, alcoholic beverages are actually getting market access in some of the markets. So the larger issue here is, when countries are giving financial bailouts, how can we ensure that this money is only going to some of the most deserving sectors? Do we have to make certain kind of a clear provision within the agreement, if at all we are going to change it in the future?
Well, let me begin by saying that I very much appreciate the comments of Professor Das. The one area we disagree is on market access for ice cream, which I would think would be essential. But I agree, James, that many of the sectors that are receiving bailouts may not merit it, or may not warrant it, or may not be the most important. I can't imagine a negotiation, though, by consensus in Geneva, where we identify sectors that would qualify or not qualify. I fear this is going to be a question that's going to be left to individual members to decide. I think that's just the reality of an organization with 164 members now. It's very hard to reach a consensus, even on a major issue like the pandemic. To return to Abhijit's comments, which I fully understand and have some sympathy with, I would only point out that in the pharmaceutical sector, we have seen instances of dual pricing for developing countries for certain products and developed countries for the same product, where there's a large price difference. I would hope that the same conclusion is reached with respect to vaccines for the pandemic. I appreciate the skepticism. I fully understand that these companies are profit-making companies, though I would wonder whether the fact that the governments have been financing some of the research will give them more leverage in deciding about the pricing. I don't know, but I think that might be a factor. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. Let me get back to Dr. Suresh Nanwani. So you spoke about the various kind of funding activities which are undertaken by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Asian Development Bank. Can you also touch upon the various categories of response measures followed by the multilateral lending agencies, specifically in relation to this COVID-19?
Yes, thank you very much, James. Let me just wade through that. This is just giving the broad picture. If you look at the World Bank document in June 2020, it's very telling. It's called World Bank Group COVID-19 Crisis Response Approach Paper. And the title is really telling: saving lives, scaling up impact, and getting back on track. Of course, it has to be on a note of positivism. It's not doom and gloom. We all can say it's gloom, but we need to get out of it. One can say, is that the end? It's not the end. We need to be resilient. That's why I keep going back to my message. We have to be resilient. If MDBs don't take that approach, how can things move on? And I want to just interject here. We've got Yuval Harari, an organization development expert. Take this opportunity of COVID-19 as a crisis of opportunity. Let us introspect ourselves. I know it sounds holier than thou art, but it's not meant to be seen from that perspective. We now can realize that remittance flows will fall, expected to fall by 20% in 2020. That's the World Bank estimate in the figure in the report I mentioned. Now, that's a lot, 20%. And that will affect many developing countries, India, Philippines, many other countries. Women are particularly hit by the pandemic. World Bank report says 740 million are in informal employment, and they're going to be affected. Billions of jobs are under threat. Now, I want to say this opportunity to see as an opportunity here, because this is where we have resilience, and this is where we can actually look at how we can be caring, inclusive, resilient. So you have organizations taking care of staff, human capital. It's so important. You know, if we don't help ourselves, who will help us? We need to help ourselves. So if you have an organization like World Bank, and I'm just bringing up World Bank, others can follow suit. They issued directives. They said, this is what you need. Work from home, get this done. Yeah. At the same time, business goes on. EBRD, the same thing. They had messages to staff. Fantastic job by the EBRD human resources. If you look at LinkedIn at her page, my goodness, I was so impressed. ADB, they had a wellness month, and they extended it not just to employees, to consultants, to retirees. It even went to the extent of saying, if you want to do a wellness session, just join us. Do a meditation. I mean, every bit counts, because if we don't help ourselves, we will be stuck. We need to help ourselves. This is it doesn't mean the old normal doesn't go, is eradicated. No, let's go back to the projects. Just as recent as this year, India had a Delhi-Meerut regional rapid transit system project from ADB and AIB co-financing. Now that's interesting because that was probably on the table and it's still going on. You've got new projects now that I'm going to touch that I had mentioned earlier on. The COVID-19 Emergency Response and Health Systems Preparedness Project, AIIB and World Bank co-financing. And again, it helps. Then you've got another one called CARES, COVID Active Response and Expenditure Support, AIB and ADB, with ADB as lead co-financier. Then you've got yet another one, Emergency Assistance Program in Combating COVID-19 from NDB, $1 billion. I mean, you can see the amounts that have come in, and you know, you could have more from bilaterals. So I'm just saying, this is how much you have. And again, I mentioned in the case of India, for the education sector, for the digital divide, they had a loan from World Bank this year in June, because it's going to be education down the system. So it means things go on. And I want to stress this is so important. You know, accountability mechanisms where if you have projects that are not working well in the sense that people are affected by it, they want to complain. How do they complain? Does it mean life stops? No, they can complain. So international organizations like MDBs who have accountability mechanisms are actually issuing notes to say, if you have got a complaint and you need more time, you can't file your documents, or we think you're ineligible, but if we think you need more time when you get more information, we will wait and we will look at a matter again. And I want to bring a clear-cut example to give flash. You have a project in India. In India, it is called the Project on Andhra Pradesh for Enhancing Climate Resilience of India's Coastal Communities. The complainants file a complaint. And this is what the Green Climate Fund redress mechanism. It held it was ineligible, but it still gave a caveat to say here, and I'm just going to quote, it is willing to review and reopen the case if there is new information coming or new evidence coming from the complainants that was unavailable to them, because in the light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in India and globally. That's a recognition. That's the care. That's what I'm saying it takes. That you need to be resilient, you need to be caring, you need to be inclusive.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nanwani. In fact, we don't have that much of time left, maybe another 5-6 minutes. So during this time, I just want to pose a single common question to all the panelists. And it is a very, very general question. So based upon the developments that are happening in various developing countries, various developed countries, and within the international economic community, do you think that the world that we are going to emerge in, the post-pandemic world, is it going to be a just and fair world, or will it be worse than the situation at the moment? So what is your own prediction? I know that it is a very difficult question to answer, but given your own experience and understanding of the functioning of business, international business diplomacy, and the rule of law systems, what do you think? What is your take about the post-COVID world? Will it be a just and fair world when compared to the past, or will it be even worse?
Should I go, James?
I think, yeah, in the same order in which we have been following, yeah.
Okay. Of course, I have some pretensions of being a fortune teller and a crystal ball gazer as well. But on this question, I totally throw my hands up. But still, let me stick my neck out. And much as I would like to end this with an optimistic note, but what all has been happening over the past few months compels me to really speculate that the world order is gradually breaking down, and it will need a very high degree of statesmanship in a large number of countries to make it more just, more fair, more rule bound. So far, we've seen very little evidence of it. And let me just stop at that.
Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Appleton?
Abhijit and I are in agreement. The world order is breaking down. We have had a lack of US leadership and a lack of European leadership, but this has left opportunities for other countries. I am actually positive on the future of India. When we think about it, the Serum Institute in Pune is the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, is working with AstraZeneca to test the vaccine that India will probably eventually roll out. And that means that a developing country is taking the lead and will inspire other developing countries. I find it very positive when India cooperates, and that's Suresh's word, but I agree with it, with South Africa and other countries to put forth a proposal. It may work, it may not, but I see a paradigm shift in leadership, which I think is positive. But I also agree with Abhijit. There are it's hard to be positive right now, and there will be winners and losers. Up until now, when we look at the pandemic, the United States has been one of the losers. They've failed to control it. Other countries have been far more successful, including countries in the developed world. And that I find to be a source of hope, a positive factor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Dr. Nanwani?
I see the expressions from the two speakers, and I think there is confusion, there is uncertainty, but out of all that, something will rise because there has to be hope. And how that hope manifests will be a new order. If countries, and I'm now talking, perhaps we're going to the realm of politics, but if you have new voices coming up, a new order coming up, and leadership to boot, that will be a telling sign, because it is a new order with new agendas coming up, and the ones who have faced the worst with the largest populations in the world, they are the ones that will make an impact, because they will take the stage and say, we've come out from this. And I think that's really good, important. But at the end of the day, everyone has to share. So it's very important. It is just not I take all. It has to be shared for humanity. And I think that's very important. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Nanwani. In fact, I think it is very difficult for me as the moderator of the panel to conclude anything. Of course, there is a saying, we are in it together. There is actually a sense of, I think, sharing a sense of understanding the concerns of each other. Perhaps I think my feeling is that we are actually better off in November 2020 compared to where we were in March 2020, because nobody thought that a vaccine would come out by the end of the year. That is a positive development. Although there is some kind of a discussion about the vaccine nationalism, I think many countries are cooperating. And with respect to international trade, at least, I think certain things are happening. Of course, there is some kind of a change in leadership in certain countries, which can be the trigger for some larger reforms in the WTO or maybe in the multilateral institutions. But we haven't overcome the crisis. According to some people, it may take at least maybe 1 more year. And that 1 more year can actually break the back of businesses, small and medium enterprises, even big companies. I was thinking about the airline industry, the tour and travel industry, the education industry. In many countries are actually going through a tough phase. So we haven't crossed the crisis. It is actually staring it on our faces. But at the same time, I think there is hope. So let us hope that 2020 will be over soon and 2021 will be the year of hope. And on the positive note, with thanks to all the esteemed panelists and also to Mr. Kaviraj Singh and also to Vinakshi, let me conclude this panel and all the audience for their participation. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to take any questions, but we will be happy to maybe individually take it through email or whatever means. Thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you, James, very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. James, and all the other 3 speakers. It was wonderful having the inputs from all the speakers here, and especially the positivity that is coming to us, and that yes, India is improving. I'm happy under the leadership that's taking India forward now is really good. We all are experiencing tough time along with the others who are struggling, and we ourselves are trying to survive as an organization, educate the students, help the educational institutes, help the advocates, because advocate fraternity is the most effective. It's virtual. Most of us do not have good connections, on and off, don't know work. So along with this struggle, and yes, as Dr. James mentioned, let's see, if we look back at March and we see ourselves today, we ourselves as an organization are in a better state, as we are able to, do something for some of the, not all the areas, but at least some things here and there. So let's hope that we end 2020 with a good positive note, as it came from Dr. Nanwani. And I would request all these speakers, in case some conversation is left over, we can move to the launch on the left side of our top. Before I end this session, we can, after I end this session, we can go to the launch. We have the sitting arrangement there, and we can have an open conversation, not viewed or access to anyone else except all those who are there present in the launch. With that, as an organization, on behalf of INBA, I thank all of you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I think we can meet for a minute at the lounge and then
Sure.
say goodbye. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.